Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast, looking back at last weekend's thrilling Italian Grand Prix. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the awesome duo that is 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Coop, and he's finally back on the podcast, lead editor Ian Parks, who is safely back from Monza as well. Gentlemen, what a weekend of action, both on and off the circuit. To kick things off, Sam, will come to you. What was your biggest takeaway from a frenetic Italian Grand Prix?
Oh, I mean, where do you start? There's so much to talk about.
Somewhere, mate, so find it.
All right, let's start with McLaren, because Papaya rules is everyone's new favourite or least favourite buzzword, or buzz phrase rather. Just fascinating how that dynamic is developing at McLaren. It's a really, really delicate situation for them, and you could see that in the body language and how Oscar and Lando were after the race. So I think they've really got to manage that situation well. There's plenty to talk about, and I'm sure we'll get into that more. But my biggest take home is just how precarious things are looking at McLaren now.
Absolutely. And you're right. There is so much for us to talk about in this episode. Ian, you were in Monza last weekend after a well-deserved holiday. How are you? How was the travel? And what is your biggest takeaway from Monza?
I'm good, thank you, mate. Travel was fine. Actually, Ryanair had should I mention the name of an airline? I'm not quite sure. Is that sponsored?
Other airlines
if they
available?
Sponsor us.
Yeah, exactly. Ryanair was actually properly early for once. Actually, we got touchdown 20 minutes early, my flight. So that was actually pretty good going. Top takeaway, the decline of Red Bull. As Christian Horner highlighted post-race, in particular, just how Monza highlighted the deficiencies and ineffectiveness of that RB20 right now. Great point from Sam. Yeah, of course, that was another big takeaway, of course. But yes, Red Bull well and truly exposed the deficiencies there with that car, and Max just having one almighty pop post-race. So that was pretty good as well.
Absolutely, and we'll discuss Max Verstappen's pop a little bit later on, but we've got to start with the team who are now the clear favourites for the Constructors' Championship, and that is McLaren. Okay, yes, there's still 8 points adrift, but there's a very good chance that will be overcome in the Azerbaijan Grand Prix in a week and a half. And obviously, we discussed Papaya rules, which was trending during the race. One of our articles actually was trending as well because it had Papaya rules in it. Lando Norris started on pole with Oscar Piastri alongside him. They got through the first three corners absolutely fine. But of course, as we all saw, Oscar Piastri catching Lando by surprise with a great overtake around the outside of turn 4 for the lead of the race. Charles Leclerc also got through, and actually Leclerc getting past Norris was a big factor in that race, because had McLaren ended the first lap with a 1-2, regardless of the order, there's a very good chance they would have probably escaped into the distance. McLaren has often, Ian, said so far this season, in particular, team principal Andrea Stella, that it's too early for team orders. We'll do things kind of when it happens, and that very much it is a team environment. It seems like that has now almost bitten themselves on the bottom a little bit, because Lando, yes, okay, it took 8 more points out of Max Verstappen, but he's 62 points adrift. Really, it should be even less than that.
You could put it like that. I just want to give some credit, first of all, to Oscar Piastri, because at the end of the day, that was a brilliant, ballsy overtake. Just to briefly recap the Papaya rules, just in case anybody's not heard me explain over the course of the Italian Grand Prix weekend. Basically, I asked Andrea Stella post-qualifying on Saturday with the two guys on the front row what would be the instruction to both of them going into that first chicane, where, as we have seen so often in the past, there have been numerous incidents, regardless of whether it's teammates or rival drivers. There have been incidents. And his basic response was, if it brought in the Papaya rules, and the Papaya rules are, if you're going up against another rival, you take care. If you see another car and it's Papaya, this is where the Papaya rules comes in, and you use the colour Papaya, the word Papaya to explain, you take even more extra care. And even more extra care is the exact quote unquote, the 4 words he used. Quite clearly, the two guys got through that first chicane. And I just think, having gone through that first chicane, Lando was just caught napping.
Yeah.
And Oscar saw this opportunity on the run down to the second and took it. And at the end of the day, as I say, for me, that was a brilliant, ballsy overtake, laid down a marker. But obviously, I think what has almost caught Red Bull, or sorry, not Red Bull, almost caught McLaren a little bit by surprise is just how poor Red Bull were over the course of that weekend. Recognizing that fact, bearing in mind where Max Verstappen finished, down in 6th place, having started 7th, and yes, the number of points that they managed to eat away into both the Constructors' title lead and Max's lead in the Drivers' Championship over Lando and both Oscar, they now recognise that, hold on, I think for the first time as well, bearing in mind what Andrea said post-race, I think they recognise for the first time that actually they have now got a shot at winning not just the Constructors, but also the Drivers. And as far as they're concerned, with the number of races dwindling away, yes, there are also 3 additional sprints, of course, but bearing in mind that Lando is far more closer to Max than Oscar is, that they are probably now better prioritising Lando over Oscar. And of course, it's about how that is now going to play out over the course of these remaining 8 Grand Prix and those 3 sprints, because Oscar, by the looks of it, and that move that he made, it was almost like a statement move saying, hey guys, don't rule me out of this. I'm still in it. So fair play to him for doing that. But Andrea Stella post-race has made it quite clear that for them, the priority is going to be Lando Norris going forward.
It's really interesting. And actually, Sam, kind of following on from Ian's point, it's kind of a 2-part question for you. And the first part is, do you think in McLaren's eyes, given Papaya rules, that Oscar's overtake on Lando should have happened? And also, we look back at the past, and obviously when there is a title fight, we discuss definitive moments where the championship was either won or lost. Depending on how the final 8 races go this year, do you think come the end of the season, we may look back on this moment as a definitive moment that potentially loses McLaren and Norris the championship?
So I'm going to answer your second question first. I think, yes, this will be looked at as a definitive moment, much like Hungary, because they are points that you can very easily flip over to Lando, lost opportunities. So I think, yes, that this is a defining moment, but also I think it's a defining moment for a number of reasons. I'll get onto those in a moment. But in terms of the first lap, I was frankly surprised that McLaren didn't say to the guys, look, you can fight, you can race. However, you can't do it on the first lap. Get through that first lap, and then let's see. Don't give an opportunity. The rest of the field are going to be way too close to you over those first 11 corners, and that's ultimately what's happened. It was a ballsy, robust move by Oscar. It was certainly brave. However, it was clean and it was fair. Just because it ended with Lando losing momentum doesn't mean that Oscar was in the wrong. Lando, there was space to Lando's left. Lando could have conceded the position, gone, you know what, I was as Ian says, caught napping there, live to fight another day. He tried to hang on to it, and that is ultimately what left him exposed to Charles, who himself then put a very, very good move on him into the Les mode. So I don't think you can say that McLaren was surprised, because ultimately they didn't set any terms there clearly on that first lap, and Oscar's within his right. Why it's a defining moment for McLaren? I think Lando probably still has the edge, and they should prioritise Lando. They should have made that decision weeks ago, and as Ian again points out, Red Bull's lack of pace has now caused McLaren a problem that they didn't anticipate having, which is the Drivers' Championship. I think they kind of felt that we can just, see how it goes. It's a very, very tall order to get Lando back into this. That's not the case anymore. If the last 2 rounds, that trajectory is continued over the next 8 races, Lando will be right there come the end of the season, fighting with Max. So I think what is different and particularly interesting about this situation with McLaren and team orders and how that all kind of unfolds is that we are seeing slowly but surely Oscar Piastri become a match for and potentially supersede Lando in that team. I don't think he's there yet, but I think McLaren are aware that they have a driver who could end up, say, next season, being the one that they want to prioritize. And they're trying to prioritize both, and you can't do that. They're risking upsetting both drivers, and you saw that by the demeanor of both of them in the press conference, in the photos after the race. Everything just was unhappy about that scenario, and that's where the situation is particularly precarious. So, yeah, I think they're a little bit worried about that, and also Oscar Piastri has a manager who has been a second driver and has taken his Oscar Piastri out of scenarios he's not happy with. You can't bet against, if this continues, Mark Webber starting to go, you know what? Red Bull may be a little bit concerned they might lose Max Verstappen. Red Bull could still be a fighting, a contender come 2026. We don't know. Could maybe there be a door open for Oscar at another leading team like Red Bull, where he will be that team leader? Will Mark Webber get a second shot at correcting some of the wrongs of Multi 21? So there's, and that's a huge conspiracy. That's a huge kind of stretch.
God.
But you can see where kind of like this is a multifaceted situation, and it's a very dynamic situation. So yeah, I'll cede my time now. But yeah, there's a lot to factor in, and it's very, very difficult to predict how this is going to move forward.
Absolutely.
This was always
just
going to interject. Yeah, no, it's all right, Nick. Because this was always going to be the case. This is why This is the reason why McLaren made such a play for Oscar when they recognised that his contract situation at Alpine was not as cut and dried as was obviously eventually came to light. This is a kid that's won everything in the junior formulas. Unfortunately for him, had to sit and wait a year on the sidelines for his opportunity at Alpine. That obviously never came. McLaren jumped in, got their man because they recognised, and it has been, and many other people have made remarkable comments around Oscar, believing him to be the better driver than Lando. So this, we're only 18 months into his Formula One career, and already he's showing himself, now that he's building up his confidence, now that he has this car beneath him, to certainly at the moment be the equal of Lando. I mean, as I say, that was a great move, absolutely great move that he pulled, and you're not going to see too many finer this season, I don't think, in all honesty, particularly between teammates, particularly when so much was on the line for McLaren. Unfortunately, ironically, for McLaren, it ultimately cost them the 1-2 because of the way the race then played out. If they, as we discussed on F1 Update post-race, Nick, on Sunday evening, if those two guys had held station, regardless of which driver was in front, be it Lando or be it Oscar, at the end of that first lap, then I don't think Charles Leclerc would have been able to have come through the way he did, made that one-stop, with he and Ferrari making that one-stop strategy work to perfection. I don't think he would have won that race. I think it would have ended up being a McLaren 1-2, regardless of the front left graining, the issues that both cars suffered with Oscar and Lando. So brilliant and ballsy, but ultimately it was costly as well in some respects.
Exactly. And that's why I said they should have made them hold station. I also say switch the situation slightly, and Lando leads at the end of the first lap. Then it's Charles and Oscar in third. I think the pace of the race would have been slower, because I think Lando is better at this stage at managing a race from the front. I think has an edge on tyre wear. I think Oscar, his inexperience showed a little bit. I think he felt pushed by Charles, and that's what resulted in that really kind of quick pace, which ultimately McLaren couldn't live with. So, yeah, I think Ian, you're absolutely spot on that had Oscar not made that move, which he was fully entitled to make, it seems, yeah, we would have had a very different result.
And what's really interesting as well on the Leclerc point is that had McLaren had a 1-2 still at the end of the first lap, there's a very good chance that even if Leclerc had still emerged ahead of both McLarens following their second pit stop, the gap between Oscar and Charles, or Lando and Charles, would have been considerably less than the 12, 13 seconds that it was. And the big thing as well from this weekend that we've seen is that even when McLaren are not winning races, they have got a car which is capable of having both drivers on the podium. With Red Bull, neither driver was in the top five. And this is where we're going to see some huge point swings over the remaining races. And let's move on to Red Bull because it was a crushing weekend for them. Some of the worst from Max Verstappen, calling the RB20 a monster, undrivable. Christian Horner and Dr. Helmut Marko acknowledging that there is a serious problem. Horner saying it's an aero problem, that requires an aero fix. Red Bull is in a lot of trouble, and actually, I can't remember a time where a team has had this big a problem. Maybe Aston Martin last season was a very different story, where a team has fallen off so much mid-season.
Major. Max said it post-Pen that how can a team that had the most dominant car in Formula One history go from that to this in such a short period of time? Christian Horner acknowledged it as well when I asked him the question post-race. But he did turn around and say, as quickly as they've fallen, just as quickly can they rise back up again. I don't see that though. I think that was just words to try and make it sound good, because there's only 8 Grand Prix left. There's now just a little over 3 months. And yes, while there are bigger gaps between the blocks of Grand Prix that we've got coming up to try and correct the issues, I genuinely don't see that that Red Bull could make the fixes required in this short period of time to get that car back into certainly, let's put it, a race-winning contention again. Might be able to challenge for a podium here and there, but the way Christian was talking post-race, that these issues were initially detected going all the way back to the United States Grand Prix in Austin last year. Then they significantly reared their head in the Miami Grand Prix in early May. And the key point for me was the fact that Christian turned around and said that in comparison to McLaren, which was an evolution, this year's car being an evolution of last year's car, he felt that Red Bull had gone too far with regard to this year's car compared to last, that they were a bit too aggressive. And he basically said that the fixes that now are required have to simplify the car. And whilst there is aero related, predominantly the balance issues of that car are so bad that no matter what updates they throw at it now, whether they try and cure the front, there is this vicious circle whereby it then affects the back. If they try and then find a fix for the rear, it then affects the front. As I said, the quote unquote vicious circle were the words that Christian Horner used, and that is the spiral in which Red Bull now finds itself. And you've got to wonder, at such a late stage in the season, when they're, and again highlighting what Christian said, when they're getting 3 different sets of data from CFD, from the wind tunnel, from the track, and of course what they're getting on the track always takes priority of CFD and wind tunnel. But when you're getting 3 different sets of data and they're not correlating, you know that that car is so fundamentally flawed right now with the way it is, given the updates that they've tried to apply to it, that I cannot see that this is a quick fix to get it back into race-winning contention before the end of this season.
And sorry, just very quickly, and also, if they do, over that 3-week gap that we have after the Baku Singapore stint, they have to nail that, because if they don't, you've then got 6 races in 7 weeks, two triple headers, and there's no opportunity at that point really to bring the developments that they could in that 3-week gap. So they've got to. That's their only option. I've actually got a question, if I may, Nick, slightly stealing your seat for a second.
More than welcome.
The winter changes. Do you think that it was almost a sense of not being cocky, but overconfident and maybe a little bit complacent about the opposition? Or do you think it was almost a fear of, there's a known phenomenon that when you are at the top of the mountain, when you've achieved something great, as they did last year, this pressure to recreate that, to continue that. Do you think that they were maybe over aggressive because of that? Or we need to be not as strong as maybe last year, but we need to continue that, and we're kind of almost looking behind us too much. Do you think there was anything like that that's almost psychologically fed into the system at some point, and that has then had a knock-on effect that we're now seeing?
Go for it, Nick. You answer a question for a change.
My turn. I go with your latter. Red Bull was so incredible last season, and speaking personally, I think they of course would have wanted to replicate that, maybe yes, but more continue that level of dominance. And the thing is, we saw towards the end of last season that the likes of McLaren were catching Red Bull. Had Red Bull done little over the winter, odds on they wouldn't have started the year as strongly as they did, in my opinion. And actually, I think your point about trying to be bold, trying to maybe be over creative is probably right. Red Bull realised they needed to, like they did with the RB19, they realised they needed to think further outside the box to try and continue that level of dominance. And unfortunately, McLaren, with the evolution of what was already a much improved package last year, has just gotten better and better, and is really the only car on the entire grid which has continued to improve with every single upgrade. We have seen so many teams take significant steps backwards with certain upgrades. Ferrari being one of them, obviously Red Bull now, Aston Martin were the big ones last year, Mercedes is another. And actually, I think it is a case of they were just trying to be over creative and again push the limits too far, because as yourself and I have discussed previously, Ian, that actually Red Bull last year kind of hit the top of the trajectory of the performance curve of what's capable in the current regulations. And once you hit that top, where do you then go from that? Do you then try another route which maybe has a higher performance curve? And I think the problem with Red Bull is that ultimately this car hasn't got that. It hasn't got the ability that the RB19 had. And how do you, in Red Bull's case, how do you build on what was last year a perfect car, the most dominant car in F1 history? How do you build on that?
They did it by trying to do something a bit different.
Exactly.
And
revolutionary.
Quite obviously revolutionary rather than evolutionary, which is the way McLaren went. But obviously McLaren was on a good trajectory, as you quite rightly mentioned, bearing in mind what they did from the Austrian Grand Prix last year onwards. And so for them, it was just a natural curve, that natural progression of that upward curve, of that upward trajectory on which they were on. But as you say, there's unlikely ever that season will be replicated that Red Bull had last year. So it's almost like it wasn't quite perfection because they didn't win every single race. Obviously, Singapore was the one anomaly. Yeah, not quite, but almost. It's almost a case of, where do we go from here, guys? They tried something different. They've got the RB20, and when it unveiled, I remember being there at the unveiling, it was like, oh, hold on, this is a bit different.
Spaceship.
And quite clearly, it's so different that right now, whatever they throw at it has just fundamentally misaligned the balance of the car so badly that they really cannot see what the fix is right now for it. And that's why we're getting all these comments from Max, from Helmut, from Christian. They've got so precious little time to work this out now, because most definitely the constructors' title is going the way of McLaren. I'm actually not going to rule Ferrari out too much just yet. They're not that far behind. Now, while I appreciate that was a Monza special package, they go well round street circuits. Singapore, they should particularly go well. They had a good end to last season, and if they can replicate that, they might just well be in this mix yet. But with regard to the drivers' title, that's the one that there will be. Well, obviously they want to cling on to both, of course, quite naturally. But given the gap that there is in the drivers, 62 points between Max and Lando, they will see that as the one that they've got to defend more than the constructors, because the constructors, as I say right now, is heading the way of McLaren.
And I think just the final thing on Red Bull is that actually it's a very sticky situation because there's not long left this season for them to try and get on top of their issues. And actually, as a lot of the team principals have said, there's going to be little development going into 2025 because as soon as January comes, the majority of the teams will switch their attention to 2026 and obviously the new power unit regulations. There's a good chance that the Red Bull, if they don't solve these problems, like you pointed out, Sam, really during that 3 week break between the upcoming double header and then the Americas triple header, if they don't solve it then, that's kind of going to put them on the back foot, you'd imagine, for 2025, because Red Bull can't then spend 6 months next season, for example, trying to make their car for next year ultra competitive, because that's just going to backfire on their prep for 2026. So is this now, this our audience might think we're being a bit over dramatic, but actually this is, Sam, a genuine race against time for Red Bull, not just to save this season, but actually next season as well.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. And I remember months ago, I said that, and I used Ferrari as an example, obviously, because they were getting Lewis, that I wouldn't be surprised that towards the back end of the year, Ferrari would have made gains to a point that they kind of thought, oh, maybe 2025 is on the table. And it's been so long that they might just go for it. They might go, you know what? We might be on the back foot slightly in 2026 because of it, but we have an opportunity to win a title here. I think the way the season has developed makes that more likely that teams are going to funnel more resources into 2025 than I think maybe we thought they would, because we'd kind of written off as what's Red Bulls to lose, and it still is to a certain extent. But to answer your question, I think Red Bull are in real trouble here because they have to unwind so much, and it took McLaren a fair amount of time when they did that, and that's ultimately what set them on the correct trajectory that they're on now. At the start of 2023, they put their hands up and said, look, we took a wrong turn, and we are now behind where we wanted to be because of that. Come the summer, they were there and they've started to build, but it's taken another year from that point. Red Bull do not have the time to fix that within this regulation cycle. So they may actually be better suited to go, you know what, it's going to be a painful 18 months, potentially. We will be the fourth best team, potentially, over the next season and a half. However, we've got to come out swinging in 2026, especially if we want any chance of keeping Max. So that's where Red Bull have a real conflict in their priorities. I think more so than a lot of the other teams. It's really, really difficult one to call as to how they will see that scenario and what they do. But I think they're the ones, because they have the de facto target on their back, they're the ones that everyone are going to kind of criticize the most.
Absolutely. And with everything in F1, only time will tell. Let's discuss something more positive because I'm conscious of time. We've still got a couple of talking points, one being very spicy to get through. Let's talk about Charles Leclerc. Obviously, stunned everyone Ferrari did with the one-stop strategy. And we discussed that obviously on Sunday, Ian. But obviously, Ferrari introduced significant upgrades for Monza to try and overcome in a way some of the issues they've had earlier in the year since they introduced their first real big package in Spain. And actually, it seems to have worked. It's some of our audience pointed out that Leclerc is not that far off Norris. He's kind of been, in a way, kind of the unsung hero of this season, because actually he's not that far off that title race.
Yeah, there's 2 points I'm going to make to that around surrounding the Charles's victory. First point was actually something you and I discussed on the Friday F1 update after practice. And I remember remarking then on the comments from the engineer Jock Clear. And he'd done a media session on the Friday morning, as three teams always do on Friday morning. That's spread out across the course of a season on this occasion, because of the extensive nature of the upgrades on that Ferrari. Jock Clear was put up on Friday morning, and he made it quite clear that because it's Monza, because it's the team's home race, that the resources applied to that package are always a little bit more than anything else that they bring over the course of the season, because it is so important to not just Ferrari, but to a nation in many respects. Ferrari is Italy, Italy is Ferrari. And so that's why we saw such a package, the Monza Special, as I've described it, on that Ferrari this weekend. Secondly, relating to the pace, Andrea Stella, post-race, turned around and said that it was a mistake for everybody to believe that McLaren had the quickest car. He said you only had to look at the way Charles managed to relatively comfortably stay on the pace of Oscar throughout the majority of that first stint to appreciate that actually Ferrari's car was just as quick as the McLaren. It was just as good. Charles was asked post-race, so what now? Does this mean that we can expect Ferrari to be as good over the coming races? He tempered that slightly with the anomaly of Singapore. He did highlight Singapore as the one race where he felt Ferrari is going to be particularly good. For me, they're two very different street circuits given the nature. A lot of similarities, but also very different in many respects. For me, Ferrari produces a good Azerbaijan Grand Prix in Baku and follows that up with what Charles is hoping and expecting will be a good Singapore Grand Prix, then I don't think at this stage, or I say at this stage, as I say, at that stage, coming out of those two Grand Prix, if they've managed to do something equally as good as they did in Monza, then you can discount either Charles for the drivers or Ferrari for the constructors.
As George Russell said after the race, what is going on with F1 at the moment? There is just drama and excitement everywhere. One driver who will not be in Azerbaijan is Kevin Magnussen. Ian, we addressed obviously his one race ban. Obviously, had a collision with Pierre Gasly, got a 10-second time penalty, and more crucially, 2 penalty points, meaning he has reached 12 penalty points in the last 12 months. Now, it's a controversial topic, and the reason for that is consistency in the stewards. Pierre kind of even raised an eyebrow at the fact that Kevin got the penalty that he did. As we discussed in the update, the positions of the drivers didn't change. Pierre stayed ahead of Kevin. Neither driver sustained damage to their car. So, racing incident, you would imagine. The thing that's a problem here that we kind of started to discuss in the F1 update is there was a more serious incident on the first lap, obviously surrounding Daniel Ricciardo and Nico Hulkenberg, where obviously going into my mind's gone blank now, turn 9, I believe it was. I may be wrong, but anyways, going into a corner, Nico was kind of forced off the circuit onto the grass at high speed. Could have been a massive accident. Thankfully, it didn't happen. But it was only a 5-second time penalty and 1 penalty point for Ricciardo. Nico Hulkenberg also got a 10-second time penalty in that race. There's been a massive amount of inconsistency in the incidents and the penalty that has been given. Sam, it does feel that actually Kevin can feel pretty hard done by the fact he does have this one race ban, because it almost feels like it kind of felt like, when was it going to happen? Almost a when rather than an if. But the fact that it's happened under these circumstances, it doesn't exactly feel right.
It doesn't. There's a lack of consistency in how these penalty points have been applied for these sorts of incidents over the last year or two, and I think it, and obviously this isn't the case. I can't stress this enough, but it's almost like in the steward's room, they're like, oh, you know what? Just kind of waiting, like, oh, I hope Kevin does something here, or just as soon as he did, go, guys, we have an opportunity here to do something quite controversial, something quite funny. Obviously, that isn't the case, but it feels like the punishment doesn't fit the crime. In fact, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. It doesn't feel like it. That is the case. They've come to that conclusion. They are right to, having come to that conclusion, whether or not that was correct or not, they are right to enforce the ban. Had they got to 12 points and said, actually, retroactively, we're not going to apply that suspension because we're looking back at Saudi Arabia and Miami and we think we were maybe a bit harsh, that would have really eroded and undermined their authority when it comes to deciding these things. So I think they had to go down that course once they'd made that error with applying the penalty points. I think Pierre Gasly's right. I think Kevin Magnussen is rightly aggrieved. But I think the bigger issue is how we got to this point in the first place, that Kevin Magnussen was even on the brink. If you take Saudi Arabia and Miami, because that's where a lot of those points were accrued, let's not forget, for his robust defensive tactics in aid of a very good team game that he played. What the stewards should have done, and they could have said, you know what, we're going to take him out of this scenario because he's just accumulating these points and these penalties, and these time penalties are going to get tacked on at the end or the next pit stop. They could have taken him out of that scenario and said, drive through. Remove him from where he is on the track, and therefore it stops Haas being able to use those tactics. That's what they should have done. And we wouldn't be in the situation we are now in had they. So ultimately, the rules around what leads to a penalty point or what the punishments are at the time, they need to be reviewed as well as the penalty point system, because it's basically an encompassing conversation. There's so many different parts to it, and it all has to be looked at individually and then taken as a sum. So yeah, ultimately, as I've said, they were wrong on the penalty points or the number given, especially when you look at how many Daniel Ricciardo got for Nico Hulkenberg, for pushing Nico Hulkenberg off. And I think it was Ascari, actually, the corner.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And then, and they've shot themselves in the foot because it was the same race, pretty close, not too long after. So you've got a direct comparison. And ultimately, when you've got the driver who was hit saying, I think that's harsh, you've maybe taken a step in the wrong direction.
Ian, any adding thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just Pierre's reaction when he was informed in the pen post race, because the announcement from the FIA fell in between having spoken to Kevin and then having spoken to Pierre. So we saw that the document had come through. So Pierre didn't know. He was aghast. And I do not use that word lightly. The look on his face when he was informed that Kevin Magnussen would now be facing this ban after that particular incident said it all. Because the bottom line for Pierre was, okay, there was an overtake made by Kevin. It took them both off the track, but it was one of those where, and this is what the stewards for me should have taken into consideration, there was no damage. It didn't affect any other car around them. Both guys managed to carry on. And for Pierre, his point was such that I asked him the question, it wouldn't make any difference, but, do you want to go to the stewards and vouch for Kevin in this instance? If you're saying that it was almost a non-incident because there was so little impact from the outcome of the attempted overtake. And he said yes, he was going to, but it's all done and dusted. You can't do it. Once something like that is there, apart from the actual team on the receiving end and the driver on the receiving end trying to make an appeal, a driver, the opposing driver, the rival driver cannot go and aid that particular driver's cause. But I thought I'd just ask the question anyway, just to see what his reaction would be. Because I made the point, I said, look, this isn't your call. It's nothing really to do with you now. But because of this, because of the comments that you've made, that you weren't affected, that there was no damage, that you both carried on, surely there's an argument to be made here on Kevin's behalf that this ban now is totally unjust. And he was quite clear. And I remember, and I mentioned as well on the Sunday F1 update, Nick, when we discussed Fernando Alonso.
Yeah.
It's a point that he's raised before, and it's a point that he raised again post-race, that some of these penalty points applications are for things that should just not be written into these statements that come out from the FIA. It surely must be for something really dangerous, something that has caused another driver to be severely affected, for his car to be severely damaged. There has to be a grain of common sense going through the stewards to think, well, actually, hold on a second. Yeah, okay, the overtake didn't come off. They went off track, but there was no damage in this instance. Whereas Nico Hulkenberg, as we've discussed, that turn one incident going into a Ascari with Daniel Ricciardo, he almost went off the track. Well, he partly did because he kicked up so much dust and gravel that it affected those behind, and he has sustained damage to his car. So I remember making this comment on the Sunday. I don't understand the logic and the thinking that went through the minds of the stewards on that Sunday afternoon when they looked and appraised both incidents and thought, that's only worth 5 seconds and 1 penalty point, but that's double the punishment, even though there was far less impact. Don't get it.
With the Magnussen-Gasly incident, it's almost tantamount to a judge bringing down the gavel and giving its verdict when it knows that we're 5 minutes out from hearing from a star witness. Like, why have they made that decision before Pierre's had his input there? Surely you'd bring both of them to the stewards and say, right, let's hear it from your perspectives. Because isn't that what usually happens? Both drivers are summoned?
Yeah, because they've got to apply the penalties on the track at that given time. Doing it retrospectively, we have so much argument about, oh, God, here we are 2 hours after a Grand Prix, and we're only just getting the result, whereas that was something that can easily be looked at from the multiple camera angles that they have. And let's face it, they do have way more than we see either live at the track or whatever, wherever you're viewing it by the world feed, whatever channel that's used, obviously Sky Sports F1 in the UK. The FIA has so many more camera angles, but I do still feel that there was a degree of common sense that wasn't applied to that particular penalty, regardless of what they saw from their various camera angles, compared in relation to the Ricardo Hulkenberg incident on that one.
Definitely. And obviously it's quite funny because we make the point there, obviously, about waiting for the stewards' reports and the verdicts after a race. That's what Ian, you and I normally say after every race, because we're normally waiting a few hours to do our F1 updates. Guys, amazing stuff as always. For those who have been watching this podcast on YouTube, let us know your thoughts on anything we've discussed in the comment section below. From Ian, Sam, and myself, this has been the latest episode of the Racing News, the 365.com podcast. See you later.
Thanks for listening and watching. Take care, folks.
Thanks for joining us.